environments, which include obviously our bioscapes and our seascapes, but also our youth and talent, and lots of other things, digital technology advancements and so on. And yet, in order for this opportunity to be realized, obviously we need to underpin that with finance and with lots of innovative forms of finance and a rapid scaling. So today it's about getting down to business. So in other words, what does this challenge look like in practice? How do we actually make things happen, which is the focus for tomorrow. So our task today is to deliberate on this and really come up with a few action points that we can take forward. And I've got a great panel to help share perspectives and to discuss this issue in more detail, which we know is a significant issue. But first I'm going to hand over to Maëlys, who's a colleague from the Catalyst Fund. She's managing partner. Catalyst Fund is a global accelerator which combines capital and venture building support to ventures that are supporting climate tech startups focused on improving livelihoods, resilience, startups that support climate smart essential services and so on. Catalyst Fund is a partner of ours. We've helped support it establish its GP in the first place, and we're now investing in its Africa fund, and we're pleased to announce that the first close of that fund is actually being launched today, so that's a great achievement for our partnership. So Maëlys is going to help set the scene. Thank you, Maëlys.
Great. Thank you, Juliet, and for taking the punchline of my speech, which was our announcement. No, I'm kidding. Indeed, tomorrow is going to be a day of getting down to business, because at the end of the day, what we're here to do is really taking commitments, taking words, and turning them into actions. And I'm really pleased to be part of this fantastic community of climate tech innovators, from fund managers to startups to the financiers that are enabling it all to really make a move in the right direction. So the summit is really all about articulating how Africa can be a leader in climate action. It can be a powerful hub for climate innovation, and also a powerful hub of climate investment from both the public sector and the private sector. So it is indeed the most vulnerable continent to climate change impacts, no question. However, its abundant natural resources, its vast lands, its real renewable energy assets, and its youthful population, the talent that we have on the continent, are positioning to be a leader in low carbon green growth, but also innovation for climate adaptation and resilience, which is a space that, of course, at Catalyst Fund, we're extremely excited about. And over the past decade, actually 2 decades, the African innovation broadly, like tech innovation scene, has really been booming. And most recently, even the climate innovation scene. And I've been lucky as a leader of an early stage fund in this space to have a front row seat to what those innovations are and how we're able to really change lives on the ground if we have the right capital structure, the right support to entrepreneurs. For example, in the past years only, from 2020 to 2021, the amount of funding going to climate tech solutions has doubled, 2x, right? So it's already like a leap forward. And I think even this past year, we're going to see even more improvements, more advances in the number of funds looking at this. And in fact, even just on this panel, but more broadly in the ecosystem, we now count at least 20 funds dedicated to back startups tackling the climate crisis. And that's amazing, right? From venture studios like Delta 40, you'll hear from them today, to early stage funds like ourselves and Persistent, focused more on energy and mobility, for example, or later stage funds like Novastar, Goodwell, Equator, right? All of us are really tackling the financing needs across the continuum, and doing that in a way that doesn't leave any gaps, right? And yet, we're far from where we need to be, and I'll get that in a moment. At the same time, entrepreneurs are also meeting the challenge. So you'll hear from 2 amazing entrepreneurs, Noor Nation and Tola, 2 startups that are building fantastic solutions for climate resilience and energy efficiency, and improving livelihoods and increasing incomes for the vulnerable communities at the front line of climate change impacts. Yet, as I said, we're far from where we need to be. As everyone here knows, the climate adaptation financing gap alone stands at 579 billion by 2030. Today, we're at about 11 billion by year in commitments. This means that we have to quadruple the amount of funding by year. 40 billion by year need to be mobilized to meet this financing gap. This is huge, right? Like, we're really far from our target. And it's a wake-up call. Like, we need to increase the scale, the breadth, and the speed of financing in ways that actually get to the entrepreneurs solving challenges on the ground and to the communities that ultimately need to benefit from these resilient solutions. We're talking about trillions, right? We're talking about a lot of capital, and yet the infrastructures is not there to ensure that we go from big to small and incorporate the voices of those that are actually doing the work on the ground. And capital, I would say, is only one side of the equation, because if we want to take these solutions to true commercial scale and true impact, we also need to bridge another gap, which is the support to entrepreneurs. Support in terms of talent, skill set, support in terms of networks, access to markets, infrastructure. And that means bridging the technical and scientific knowledge together with the experimental knowledge on the ground, with local community knowledge, and bringing all those things together for solutions to really take off and meet communities' needs. So the question I'd pose to the audience today is, how do we, all together, combine capital, talent, combine knowledge for impactful initiatives to reach their full potential? And I'll leave you with one sentence that I've recently heard at the Global Environmental Facility reunion, where the head of the World Bank Environment Directorate said, we need more, we need faster, we need better instruments for finance to really tackle this climate crisis, and we need all of us in the ecosystems to do it together. So I hope you all will hear from these fantastic speakers and leave inspired by what each one of you can do to be a part of the solution. Thank you.
Thank you, Mylise. Can you hear me all right? And I'm very conscious that this thing is in the way. Hang on, I'm just going to move it. Okay, great. Well, Mylise has kind of done my job for me. So I almost feel like I should hand over this moderation role to her. But I think, big picture, big opportunity, some tangible progress being made, but a hell of a lot of stuff that needs to happen, and a lot of us working hard, but we need to work harder. So I'm going to introduce the panel. I'm going to start with Nele. Nele, if you could wave your hand. So Nele is a co-founder and CEO of Tolla, which is a South African-based digital platform that's providing a certification process for African farmers to help link them to global export markets. And so it's helping to build efficiency, reduce costs, make it more affordable to be able to link to those off-takers. So welcome, Nelly. Raghi Ramadan, who is the co-founder and CEO of Noor Nation. I heard this morning that Noor in Arabic stands for light. Yes. So it's a sort of innovative renewable energy startup that's helping to design and manufacture sort of decentralized, innovative renewable energy products that are helping to sort of bring safe water and clean energy to rural communities and farming businesses and so on in Egypt. So we've got South Africa and Egypt. And then we have our investment community. We've heard from Mylise. We've got Rurimu from Persistent. So Warimu is a partner of ours. We invest in Persistent as FSDA Africa Investments. And so we help Persistent to anchor its fund and develop its strategy and crowd in other investments. And it's really a sort of climate venture builder that helps invest capital and venture building support to companies that are focused primarily in the sort of e-mobility and the renewable energy and energy efficient sectors. So welcome. And Rodney at the end. Rodney is the platform director at Delta 40. So that's a venture studio that focuses on building support to tech-enabled climate action businesses, again focusing on energy, agriculture, mobility companies. So welcome. So I'm going to start with the startups. So Raghi, I'm going to ask you, basically elaborating on that very brief intro, can you just say in 1 minute the problem that you're trying to solve and the innovation, how your innovation is helping to support climate innovation action?
Yes, sure. Thank you so much, Juliet. I will try to summarize the problem that NeuroNation is tackling in one single word, which is infrastructure. So it is not just the fossil fuel, the diesel, the 2.8 billion people that are lacking access to energy and water. And it's not about the costing, whether they have money or not. It's about the infrastructure. So NeuroNation develops and manufactures innovative clean energy and water solutions infrastructure that can provide energy and water, which are life essentials, to rural communities and farming and agribusiness that are located in Egypt and sub-Saharan Africa.
Great, thank you, Raghi. Same question, Nelly.
In 1 minute, right?
In 1 minute.
Okay. So at Tola, we accelerate biosecurity compliance for small and medium-sized businesses. So we enable them, we enable businesses to get access to affordable, accessible, and adequate certification of their businesses, because as we see currently in agriculture in Africa, over 90% of the farmers, of the almost 35 million farmers that we have on the continent, lack biosecurity compliance. And biosecurity compliance is an umbrella for things such as organic compliance, compliance that allows them to do global trade, food safety, food security, because right now it has been so fragmented. It's tailored for large farms. There has never been anything that talks to smallholder farms or emerging commercial farmers. So we accelerate that.
Great, thank you. So we've been talking about how we can catalyze early stage financing into businesses like yours, so that to get you from that very early stage through to a stage where you can really start to scale and grow. And so we'd just be interested to hear a little bit more about your financing experience. What has it been so far, and have there been any kind of particular barriers that you would like to share with us? And again, Nele, perhaps I could start with you.
It has been painful. I think every startup could talk that raising funding is painful. Even when you are able to raise funding, it's still painful. But with us, it has been painful at first, and I think that in as much as I can blame a lot of the VCs who said no to us, but I think that as we are starting Tola, we had not been able to find our true North Star, and we're not able to communicate our story of impact. So a lot of times when we spoke to VCs and different type of financial institutions, we're not able to capture our story quite well. I think when we started capturing our story quite well, as we started really painting the picture of our impact, that's when a lot of investors started understanding the potential of our business, and it became a bit easier. We still get a lot of no's, but we still do get a lot of yeses. Out of 100, getting 2 is still great. It's still a win. Working with Catalyst Fund and so many different other organizations that have been part of our journey. So it's painful, but then it has also been a learning experience because I had to grow in the process.
Okay, I can agree more with Nelly that it has been also painful. Since we incorporated NeuroNation, and even before that, when we came with the idea of NeuroNation, until the moment, it has been bootstrapping. Yes, there have been some money, soft money, like from awards and grants here and there, but very few money. But the main funding was like bootstrapping. The good thing that our first prototype was actually our first sales. So this was a success, and although it has been very painful to go all of this, like almost 2 years on bootstrapping, but we actually learned two very important things. First one is to be resilient as possible as you can. Second one is when you receive money, you have to make every dollar counts. Yeah. Yes, I agree with what Nelly also said about that. We should worry about having a client and reducing our client acquisition costs. And if the client is there, and if the client is happy and satisfied, then everything will follow. This is the most important thing for us. So quick about our funding.
Great. No, thank you. It's good to paint that initial picture, and we'll ask that question of the investors just now. But before I turn to the investors, I think Miley's talked about sort of innovative climate financing and the fact that we need to sort of tap into different forms of finance in order to fulfill different financing needs. And I just wondered what kinds of financing and related support you think you need as a business to be able to take yourself forward. And maybe we can start with you, Raghi.
Yeah, thank you, Juliet, for this question. It's a very important one. It is misunderstood that entrepreneurs or startups, sometimes they think that they should have direct access to finance. So they should always receive the money and the cash to themselves. While we see it from a different perspective, that startups, if I'm a startup and I have a financing institution that can actually finance my client or customer, and then the client or the customer will buy the product because for him it became affordable, and this financing institution, for example, will pay the money for me directly. This is a type of financing and support. It is not necessarily only that should be go to directly to the startup. Sometimes it is even more important to finance your end user and your end beneficiary, and in this way you will grow and your scale. In addition to, when it comes to also financing, not only building the capacity of the startups itself, but also building the capacities of the financing institutions that have been financing and investing in the startups. So for example, in Egypt, I really wish that there are many, like 10 or hundreds of FSDA organizations who have been building the capacity of financing institutions, so that at the end of the day, we don't stumble at the case that there is a very good and attractive funding program that actually ultimately cannot reach to the end user, because there is a lot of people and organizations in the middle of this cycle. So the more we shorten this cycle and create shortcuts from the funding programs or funding institution to the end user, this will be much better.
They always say the best sort of financing for any startup is customer revenue. But we understand that in climate tech, it's quite difficult because on average, a lot of my friends who are in this space, they take about 5 years before they get to market. So the type of financing that I've seen work for quite a lot of startups within the climate tech space, because we need to also realize that the climate tech space is quite different from any other, say, SaaS type of business where you can immediately make money right away, or any fancy type of market that is trendy right now. So I would always feel like venture funding is usually what people go to first, and we would always say that investors need to start taking huge bets on startups. But I also feel like having government support startups would really be quite great, because we need to look at it at a long term. We need to have a long-term view on this. I've seen so many companies like Pachama succeed because they had support from different organizations, both VC and also grant funding, that saw a long-term outlook to the company. And that's what I'm looking at, both venture funding and also looking at government and also family offices. And a lot of times I fight VCs because I always say, you guys need to give us money. But I also realize that VCs also have to raise money from someone else. And I always say, a lot of high net worth individuals, family offices, they really need to listen to our stories. So it's one of those things where I say we need to start building relationships with VCs. We shouldn't put them on the other side saying them and us. We need to start having a working relationship, because the better we do work with them, a better story they're able to build when they go to LPs to raise funding, because that's where the money comes from. They are struggling as much as we are doing. If we need money for climate tech, VCs also need money for climate tech as well. They care about us as much as we care about them. So if we have that type of strong working bond from both startups and VCs, and look at where we can raise funding, I think that will create a long-term benefit in terms of this sector.
Great, thank you. And that's such a good and important point. I think it resonates probably quite with a few people in this room and certainly with us. But it's a good segue to then bring in the investors on the panel into the discussion. Rodney, I'm going to start with you. And if I could just start by asking a little bit more about Delta 40 Venture Studio and how you're sort of investing in and supporting climate action ventures, and anything that's unique about your particular model. Again, just short and sharp.
1 minute as well.
1 minute.
Okay, that's a lot to fit in 1 minute, but I'll see what I can do. How many people know what a venture studio is? I've got 1, 2, 3, 4. Seems like less than 15 people. So I'll start there very quickly, and if you give me an extra 30 seconds, just to. So a venture studio, people often compare it to an accelerator, an incubator. The slight difference there is a venture studios is often a for-profit company whose product is other companies, right? So what you're doing is you're partnering with entrepreneurs and essentially acting as a co-founder with an entrepreneur and providing capital support and services to actually help build that company. So that's what we're doing at Delta 40. And the ethos behind that is all companies are unique, but the life cycle, the growth of a company, the challenges companies face, they're all relatively the same. I guarantee you the two of them will talk to you about product market fit, raising capital, understanding consumers and what their preferences are. Those are the same things. There might be different segments, there might be different targets, but it's the same challenges. So if we can find a way to make that process faster, more efficient. You talked about taking 5 years for your friends to get to market. A venture studio standardizes a lot of those processes. And what we do at Delta 40 Venture Studio is we're providing a series of services and support. So first, partnering with experienced entrepreneurs and helping them to take a business from what may be an idea and may not even be a business yet, to then find product market fit. We're providing capital, meaningful capital up to about $600,000, which is significant in African markets where we often don't have angel investments. We don't have friends and family that entrepreneurs can turn to for capital, which is what I suspect plays into that 5 years. Because people are having to work while they try to start their business and to fund it, for example. And then also providing a set of shared services. So services around HR, finance, market research, consumer insights, product design and development. All of the things that entrepreneurs have to do to build a business, we bring that in-house so that you can tap that service, you can have a shared community, and that accelerates your ability to actually build a business faster. So that's the short and sweet version, but happy to share more later on.
Great, thanks Rodney. Warimu.
Thanks. So at Persistent, similar thing to what Delta 40 and Catalyst Fund does, we bet on early stage startups in sub-Saharan Africa. So we come in at ideation, pre-seed, seed stage, and invest human and financial capital in what we call venture building, which is also something that Catalyst Fund does. What's unique about our model? We get our hands dirty. So we fill in operational roles, so it's not just strategic advisory. So what happens is when we invest, if we identify a startup, even when we are screening a startup, due diligencing a startup, we will identify challenges and view them as opportunities for venture building. For instance, if there's no corporate governance, if there are no board rules, the first thing that we'll do is go in, have a director, set up a board. If there are no policies, if there are no employment contracts, we'll mark that as something that we need to provide legal and compliance venture building for. And our greatest offering that we started with in our venture building approach is having an interim chief financial officer go into the company. Because what we realized is that startups don't have either the capacity or the wherewithal, because the CEO can't be the CFO, can't be the COO, can't be the CTO. And they also don't have the funding to hire the kind of CFO that they need. So we've got our staff going in at 50% or 25%, depending on the needs, for a year or for 1.5 years, and building their financial management, and then helping to move that to the CFO or finance manager that they get. And in that, we include also fundraising support. I mentioned legal and compliance, and our latest offering is ESG support, which we've been able to identify with the help of FSDAI, who also helped us develop our ESG management system, which we're then rolling to our portfolio.
Great, thank you. Mylise.
Well, we have actually a very similar model also to Persistent, but maybe slightly different in some ways. So I'll try to highlight that, and complementary, I think, with also what Delta Studio does. The Catalyst Fund, as I mentioned, is a pre-seed VC fund and accelerator backing climate adaptation startups that are building a resilient future in Africa. So we back companies across a range of sectors because we believe that every sector of the economy will have to adapt to climate change. And we do that in unique ways, building on actually 7 years of track record on the continent, working and accelerating ventures. Because we fundamentally believe that capital is only one side of the equation. So in our investment, we embed venture building. So each startup receives cash, but also human capital investment. And what we mean by venture building is that we essentially become extensions of the startup teams. We work with them hand in hand for 6-7 months to solve the most critical challenges of taking a product to market, getting that validation, those proof points, and then later investors want to see, and de-risking the journey of the companies for then other investors to come in. So imagine, as Rarima was saying, someone has, a founder has an incredible business background, like comes, say, you know, as that experience in sales, knows how to do even fundraising, but lacks technical knowledge on the tech side or the product side or even the data analytics side. In our team, we've built a team now of 8 full-time staff that can cover all the critical functions that a startup needs. So product, tech and data, marketing, fundraising, growth and sales, even operations and financing. And with that, in that way, can really plug the gap that the entrepreneur has in a very specific, tailored fashion. So each company will get a unique set of support. So in that example, the entrepreneur will basically have our expert software engineer and technical expert in-house or data specialist to help them build the infrastructure of the back end of the product and be that interim CTO, right? So like she was saying, interim CFO, we could even do the interim CTO and product side or head of product roles that can help that startups go faster to those milestones. Or imagine again on the opposite side, somebody does come with an amazing technical background, like Raghi, for example, and even sectoral background, but actually needs help more on connection to investors, like figuring out what the pricing strategy or the sales strategy will be. How do we actually break this down so it's affordable to communities? And as you were saying, like with low purchasing power, that's what we can also jump in and do and tailor our support that way. And the final thing I'll say is that from our background, we also have a history investing in fintech, and we do try to identify ways in which fintech can really make every climate solutions more affordable and more accessible and appropriate for low-income communities. And that also is an expertise that ends up being very helpful, like a pay-as-you-go strategy, for example, or others, to the entrepreneurs. And with that, our hope is that obviously we accelerate the path to funding, the path to product market fit, most importantly, and revenue, as Tola was saying, and yield results, right, for the portfolio. And I'll say that, you know, when we started, we actually didn't hope for, I mean, we didn't know what to expect in terms of what this approach would yield. And of our past portfolio to date, we have an 88% survival rate. Companies have raised over $650 million in follow-on funding, and they've reached over 40 million customers. So there's true power, I think, in the combination of venture building, that, you know, human capital support, and financing as well.
Great, thanks, Mylise. I'll stick with you, but I think you've just raised the issue. You know, there's 3 approaches which are both different and both similar and very in various ways. And I think you've highlighted that point about the need for sort of integrated approaches, but all are trying to achieve a similar objective. I think Nelly and Raghi raised some interesting issues that they're facing in relation to financing directly of their businesses, but also those broader issues that you talk about in terms of financing for innovation writ large. Mylise, how do those resonate with you? And if so, in what way? And I'm going to also ask Warimu and Rodney to comment as well.
Well, I feel like I'm one of them. I mean, I was a former entrepreneur myself. I did start a startup before being an investor, which obviously helps a lot in building that empathy with entrepreneurs. But clearly resonates a lot. We see every company in our portfolio, no matter how clear the proposition is, struggle with fundraising at the beginning, especially when you don't have enough customers, enough revenues on your books, and investors do have their processes. They do want to see certain things. So that definitely resonates. And in addition, the struggles of how do I optimize low resources at the beginning of my journey? If I only have so much, what's going to be my next hire? What's going to be my next partnership, right? My next sales objective, just because time is limited and time is the most precious thing at the early stage, and resources are finite. So, clearly resonates, and I hope that some of the approaches of investors in this panel are actually plugging those gaps. It's not just about providing the financing and the support, but also doing that in ways that are fast. So adjusting our own processes for deployment of capital to be quicker. And that, I think, meets a clear need. I think overall, whether you're a VC or whether you're startups, you feel the pain of lack of speed, right, in decision making, right, of investors or LPs. So yeah, it definitely resonates.
I can imagine. Warimu, what do you think?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's where the love and the passion for venture building comes in. Nele mentioned an important point, which is that in fundraising, you also need to show impact, and you need to be able to measure impact. And that's something that a lot of startups lack, because they are focused on getting the product to market. They're focused on solving the localized solutions and not necessarily thinking, okay, how do I measure impact? How do I measure CO2 avoided? How do I measure lives improved? And that's one of the areas that we found as a venture builder. We come in and really help to build in knowledge and that capacity, because ultimately, even when you're thinking about the bottom line in impact investment, even for our fundraising, we have to be able to back those numbers. And it's not really a numbers game. It's more of the impact story has to be very clear. And of course, both Ragi and Nele mentioned the circular, almost Ouroboros of fundraising. My colleague, Tukam, who's one of the senior venture builders, calls venture capital like living in a tough neighborhood, because it is a tough neighborhood, and you have to be able to get up every day. You have to be able, you've got a lot of empathy for startups, but at the same time, you're also trying to fundraise, and fundraising is difficult in venture capital. And I think being able to be partners and share our challenges together, and being able to have a common voice, even when it comes to investors, the DFIs that are looking to invest in us, is really important, because at the end of the day, the numbers matter, the internal rate of return matters, and the impact targets and impact measurement matters. And that's where we see the greatest value.
Yeah, no, it's a great point.
I mean, I think one point I'll pick up on is talking about, Nele, you talked about the ability to tell the story and how that changed once you figured that out. And that's part of every startup's journey, right? You pivot, you figure out what the right story is. But I think what kills me sometimes is that the VC world can be very focused on a particular type of narrative, particular type of company, and are looking for very specific things. And as businesses are being built in Africa, sometimes people are not building those businesses simply because it's, oh, I have this huge goal around impact. It's, I saw a problem, there's an opportunity to solve it, and there may be, it's also a way to feed my family and to generate income. And there's a gap, I think, sometimes in people understanding what do VCs look for. And I think, I'm sure Wairumu and Mylis can also speak to things coming in their inbox where you're like, well, this, I can't quite tell how this fits. And often there's a narrative VCs are looking for. There's a certain framework you're looking at. And even how that story is told can then become a hindrance, I think, for entrepreneurs who don't recognize that I've done all this work, I've put together this, long business plan, and it hurts because I can't actually get in the room because I haven't framed it in a way that people are looking for, or even the ability to understand how to connect with those investors. And for lack of, I mean, the truth of it is that it is also a question of networks and who you know. And I think this industry, climate funding, is often dominated by DFI money and money from external sources outside of Africa. So as a result, I think also African entrepreneurs are often disconnected from those funders because you may not have the same sort of relationship. So I think there's challenges, and there are companies that are working on that and organizations are working to address that. But I think just to build on your point around that challenge of telling the story and taking 5 years to raise capital and get to market, some of that is a function of that gap between what VCs want or looking for and the ability for companies to tell the story and even be able to get into the room with those VCs. And that's part of what we work on, and then is saying when we're working with African entrepreneurs and female entrepreneurs, Delta 40 has a specific goal that at least 50% of our entrepreneurs will be African and 50% will be female. I can get into why that is later, but I think on this particular point, part of what we do is then we're providing support around fundraising, which Lisa and Wairumi have talked about as well. And you're helping to remove that barrier because you're saying we have the network of investors we've built that we can then help you get in front of. We will help you refine your model. We will help you tell the right story so that you don't have to navigate those challenges and you can focus on building the business and not on the fundraising, which can become a second job unto itself, unfortunately.
Thank you. So I think you're agreeing that there's a lot of things that we all kind of can see in similar ways, even though we're approaching this from different perspectives, whether from the investment side or the startup side or the development side and so on. But what else, Rodney? I mean, are there any things that we're not really talking about that you think we should be talking about? Are there any elephants in the room and sort of real reality issues here that we need to sort of bring to the surface?
A couple of thoughts. I mean, I think one, building on my previous point, the reason Delta 40 is focusing on those groups of entrepreneurs, African and female, one is kind of a moral imperative. I think if you look at the data, the percentage of capital that is going to those groups is often in the single digits, but they are often best positioned to actually address the challenges on the continent and will have unique perspective on certain problems. But also we see that then as a business opportunity, right? If other investors are not investing in an underserved market, that is a host of entrepreneurs that we can actually then work with and generate outsized returns. The data shows that women actually build more stable, more profitable companies. You wouldn't know that looking at the Fortune 500 or even across a lot of African venture capital because it's often men doing the funding, men doing the raising. And building the businesses, but longer term, they actually build more sustainable businesses. So there's a business opportunity there, and I think that's something that it's important to confront, to say that there is a gender gap within the sector. How do we address that? How do we build structures to make that more equitable? I think another thing, to a point Wairumi raised earlier, is there is a chain that goes down, and I think, and Nelly also raised that, that when you are looking at, as a funder or as an entrepreneur, you're trying to raise capital, that VC also has their constraints based on who they got capital from. And I think we are often, the model that we're looking at of how to build businesses and VC funding, sometimes, to be honest, doesn't quite sit right with me, right? Because I think we're looking at sometimes the Silicon Valley model where we might say, okay, 1 in 10 businesses will succeed and we will count on that one business to generate outsized returns. And I think about then, what are we doing that for? What are we solving for? And it seems as well because we want to, it's primarily driven by commercial returns. And I think granted the impact space is also then looking at impact returns, but I think if that is really a core thing, that it's not just about commercial, but also about impact and the SDGs, perhaps we need to rethink that model and to think about maybe we need to build portfolios of businesses that might not be the 100x returns, but maybe it's that 5 to 20 to 30x returns, that there's a lower ceiling, but maybe there's also a lower floor, and that we have more businesses succeeding and we are solving for a broader range of challenges beyond just commercial returns. So I think we need to, in some ways, rethink how are we funding and why, and what is the ultimate objective. And I think we're having this summit because we're seeing climate challenges that have been driven by a focus on profit and on the commercial side of things. And it is the people who have contributed least who are suffering. So we might need to revisit how we actually then address those challenges.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. I think probably a lot of us are feeling that. Warimu, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, so I'll just add on, just based on how we've seen investing in Africa. I agree with Rodney, even in terms of female, either female-led startups or female teams or local founders or local teams. One of the things that we can't have in venture capital, or even in, fund of funds, DFIs investing in venture capital, is that cookie cutter approach of what applies in Silicon Valley applies in Africa, because the situation is quite different, right? Imagine, some of the issues that we've had in our portfolio of, well, your business has not gotten a local assembly license for 4 months, but you followed the process. It's just bureaucracy. And that's what investing in Africa means. It doesn't mean that the founders are being lazy, or if we have a convertible loan and we have to be, the loan has to be registered by the bank, the national bank, or the central bank of that country, because of the kind of forex controls that they have. And so you can't pay the supplier in another country because money has to actually enter the bank account in order for your loan to be registered. That's just the reality of doing business in that country. Or the fact that goods are stuck at the port for 3 months. That, again, that's, systems are changing. The Kenya government is making changes, Tanzania government, but that's the reality. And we have to be able to localize our screening, our due diligence. You've got an amazing founding team, but you go in, they have a great idea, but they haven't, for the 2 years that they've been running, they haven't done audited accounts. Well, that's because they were not aware at that time, and so we have to be able to say, okay, we understand, but are you willing to let us help you manage your financial functions? So that's, I think, on the DFI and venture capital front. It's not a cookie cutter approach. We really have to localize how we screen and how we do diligence and be ready to take risks. The second one is on founders. One of the answered things that we've faced is maybe founders who have a lot of founder syndrome. So if we go in and maybe we want to set up a board, and there has to be a chair of a board, and the entrepreneur wants to be the chair of the board, and the board is meant to work for him or her, not the other way around. Those are things that we try to let entrepreneurs unlearn and realize that we are partners. We're not coming in to manage your business, but these are all surmountable challenges, and at the end it ends up being such a beautiful thing when we see a company raising funding at Series A, Series B, Series C, because that's what we want to see. That's why we are there as venture capitalists and venture builders.
Nele, you wanted to come in?
Well, I wanted to talk about something. I don't know if you'd call it the elephant in the room. Because a lot of times I often hear the percentages of women who get funding. It's usually, it's a challenge, but sometimes we need to talk about familiarity and also talk about the challenge and responsibility that we African founders have. Because when you get into Silicon Valley, because I've stayed there and I know, you would enter a room and 99.99% of the time, I would find myself as being the black woman in the room as many times as possible. So you understand that there's a challenge of familiarity. How can people trust African women when they are never in the room? How many successful startups have been started by African women that have gone IPO? Because I usually use this example and I associate it with sport. A lot of times in football, I'll talk about football because I'm a football supporter. When a Senegalese player comes and you are a coach, you obviously assume that that player is good because they are from Senegal. If a player from Lesotho were to come who's a football player, you are going to, I need to check you play, you know, like go for trials, play 1 or 10 matches, because you don't have that type of familiarity. So hence I say it's so important for us as startups. I know it's my responsibility that I have to work 1 centillion times harder, because my success is going to open up doors for so many other founders that look like me. Because if I'm successful, especially at the global stage, any other founder who looks like me, whenever they enter the room, they are going to remember me when they look at them. So it's a responsibility on founders, and we shouldn't put it on VCs. It's on us, because if Shola from Paystack did not work as hard as they did, we wouldn't know that fintech would ever be a thing on the African continent. Flutterwave worked hard, it opened doors for other people. We also need to work hard, and at some point we need to stop talking about the stats, because they are never going to change. The bar is there, it's never going to be lowered for anyone at all. Michael Seibel from Y Combinator talks about it to say that the reality is that the bar will never get lowered for anyone at all. The best thing is for us to work 10 times harder to go ahead of the bar.
Sure. So elephant in the room. Well, first I want to definitely double tap on what Rodney said. It is true that we can't rely just on a traditional VC model, especially when we talk about climate technologies and climate adaptation and resilience at that. And so I think there's true power there in rethinking the financing structures to be more creative, like think about blending, and people talk about blended finance all the time, but how do we actually do that in more creative ways within funds? Not necessarily your usual, 20, 2 and 20 structures, but other types, leveraging all the types of capitals at our disposal, from grants to debt to equity, guarantees, first loss facilities. I mean, frankly, we structured our fund, and we're super lucky that an investor like FSD Africa and FSD Africa Investment was willing, as part of their mandate, to, for example, take a first loss and a junior position to attract senior investment. And that's already attracting, because it's de-risked, a lot of commercial capital that will see the opportunity of investing in African businesses, solving the most urgent problems here with local solutions. And then once they see, unlock even more capital from a more diverse set of investors who maybe traditionally don't wet their feet, right, in markets here. Or in business models that are yet to be proven fully, right? And as Tola said, we've seen that proof point being generated in sectors like fintech, but we're certainly not there yet in the climate space. So that's definitely one thing. And the other, as I said earlier, is the question of scale and speed of financing. I mean, the time is now. There's no time to waste. We basically have a decade to make a difference. And even just us, like the funds here, right? How much are you guys raising, Rodney? Yeah, Delta 40. 30, right? And where Remo is raising 100, we're raising 40. Like just us, we're barreling at $200 million. That's a drop in that's a drop in the ocean. It's nothing. And we said the gap is $557 million, billion dollars, $40 billion a year. So commitments aren't enough. Like, how do we actually then have tenfold the number of funds like us and others at all the stages of the continuum working hard to back the entrepreneurs. And I think that's the other big elephant in the room.
You can.
To come back to what you said, and I think fully agree with you on the responsibility that sits on founders' shoulders. At the same time, that also pains me because I also feel like in some ways it's a burden because other founders don't have to prove that, right? The non-African founders don't have that burden to say, if I'm not successful, those who come after me will not have the opportunity, right? You're not being judged. That group's responsibility is not on your shoulders. So I think it can be both. I think it can drive founders, but also it can be a burden on your shoulders too. And I think part of also then addressing that is looking at the other side of the equation. And I think to your point, it's not just that VCs have to give those founders money, because you're absolutely right that when folks are not familiar with something, they're less inclined to invest, to collaborate, to work with. It's just, that's who we are as human beings. And I think part of that is also then, how do we change the compositions of those rooms so that when you walk in, people have some familiarity with it, and ideally there is an African woman who's in that room on the other side of the table, or there's just different compositions of that, right? And I think some of that has to deal with things like the 2X Challenge and other initiatives that are looking to support female-led funds, African-led funds. I mean, and this is a US example, but how many of you know Spanx? Okay, I see women have their hands up. Spanx was a business, I forget her last name, Sarah something, but she started this business, which is shapewear for women, that you wear underneath your clothes, makes you look svelte, and I've never tried it, but you know, that's what I've heard. But she started this business, and most of the people she pitched to were male VCs, and they just did not get it. Why would you need that? It just was not a need that they could relate to, that they could understand. It's $1 billion business. She is a massive entrepreneur now, but she kept getting those no's because the people on the other side could not relate to the challenge she was solving. And I think some of that then relates to how do we make sure that people can have that familiarity. One aspect is going to be seeing successful models of it, but I think it's also then, do we have those people in the room who have understood that? And I think some of that will also be, how do we catalyze local capital, right? There's a lot of money on this continent. It may not always be in VC, but there are a lot of people with money on this continent. It might be going into real estate, it might be going abroad in other areas, but things like the Nairobi Business Angel Network, where we're looking to say, let's bring in local capital, because those people will have that familiarity, will have that sense of, I get the challenge that you're solving, I see the business opportunity, and I'm willing to put money behind it. So I think we've got to work on both sides of the equation, and I don't want it to rest on just your shoulders to prove yourself for the next generation.
No, thank you, Rodney. We're being told that we have to finish.
Sorry about that.
No worries. So I just like to, I mean, basically you've raised all sorts of issues that touch on not just the volume of capital, but the type of financing, the need for more innovation around financing, and also around the community and how we present our narrative, how we discuss our narrative, how we recreate the kind of community that we need to be able to support this sort of innovative ecosystem, and sort of the tough neighborhood. I like that expression that you mentioned, that the need to get more familiar with each other, and potentially restructuring our expectations around what we get, and perhaps a more eclectic business environment where we don't expect huge returns from everybody, but we have a real sort of mix of a heterogeneity. I just want to go one word from each of you, going back to, you know, we're talking about making things happen. This is a call for action, and I just want to ask you, what's the one key message or word that you would leave behind for the audience in the room from this discussion?
Okay. I'll start. Dare. That's my word. Dare to bet on Africa. Dare to bet on African founders. dare to take risks, because a lot of times they are perceived risks, not real risks, to be honest, on the continent. So let's just dare and let's go forth, and let's go forth and conquer.
Great one.
Is it me?
Can be.
Just start. I always say that 3 types of people in this conversation. There are those who talk about it, there are those who want it to happen, and there are those who make it happen. So you make a choice. Where do you lie?
Finally, I would like to say to everyone, and you also say this to your family and friends, that please support the founders of the African startup as possibly as you can, because they need this kind of mental and psychological support. And actually, I have been calling the founders of the startup like the orphans of the startup. Sometimes they have to go for a long and very long path alone. So please be always with them and always support them and believe in what they do at least. Thank you.
Thank you, Raggy. Rodney, one word.
My word would be question. And I say that because I think every innovation, every new business, every investor doing something differently, every government trying new initiatives comes from people saying, why is this okay? Why is the status quo how we do it? How do we do it differently? So I think continue to question, ask the hard-hitting questions, and push for innovation, because I think that's where it starts, from a place of not being content with the status quo.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks. Closing word to Maëlys.
My closing word would be together, because to answer that hard question, we need all the voices at the table, the policymakers, the investors, the entrepreneurs, the corporates, the local family offices and net worth individuals, like the innovators beyond just startups, because that takes all shapes and forms, the ecosystem builders, the researchers, the scientific community, the local community voices as well. And only in that way will actually solve this challenge, the magnitude of which obviously is beyond us. But if together, I think we'll go a lot further.
Thank you so much. And so together, could we all give the panel a round of applause? And thank you very much for coming. I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. Thank you.
as well as from international climate finance institutions on climate change mitigation and adaptation projects and programs in agriculture, energy, transport, industry, forest, urban development, and health sectors. Despite this investment, Ethiopia still needs to attract and mobilize a significant finance to support its climate-compatible development agenda. We still count on our partners to fulfill their commitments to developing countries and committing themselves for the new challenge of setting new quantified finance goals in the coming years. We also strongly urge multilateral financial institutions that rather than fueling the historical debt accumulated on the shoulders of developing countries and mainly Africa. Our future depends on our decision now. Urgent action is needed in limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius to avoid worst impact. 8 years after its signature, ensuring the implementation of Paris Agreement is not an option again. As I conclude, I would like to assure you Ethiopia's unwavering commitment to work with our fellow Africans and other global partners to achieve our priorities and the long-term objective of making the planet comfortable for present and future generations. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, my dear sister. Another round of applause for President Zewde. Let me now take this opportunity to request Brahim Ghali, the President of Sahrawi Arab Republic. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Your Excellency, President of Kenya, Dr. William Ruto, and also his head of the Committee of Heads of States on Climate Change, and also head of the AU, and also Mr. Musa Fiki, head of the AC, Your Excellencies, heads of states, heads of governments, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure at the outset to extend my wholehearted thanks to the Republic of Kenya, the government of Kenya, and the people of Kenya, and President William Ruto for this gracious invitation to attend this meeting. Would like to thank you for the excellent hospitality, and would like to thank you for all sorts of efforts and generosity for the sake of the success of this great event, which is the Climate Summit in Africa. And our Saharan Republic also is facing the climate change like so many other countries in the world. We're facing all these challenges related to climate change. Meanwhile, we have another struggle to put an end to occupation in my countries due to the occupation because of the conflict with Morocco. And those challenges are intertwined. This situation led to the displacement of more than 200,000 of our citizens to some territories that are suffering from climate problems, and temperature in the refugees camps are immeasurable. In our occupied territories, the different practices of occupation, which is outside the control of the international law, without any kind of control. It leads to the aggravation against climate change, like, for instance, the problems with fishery, and this depletes our water and agricultural resources for the sake of exports. And this kind of military occupation is sort of a wall and divides our country into two parts. And this deprives the occupied territories from water. And this is a very dangerous environmental deterioration. And this increases drought in our region. It also led to so many deeply rooted changes in the surface of the land, which became more exposed to wind erosion and also water stagnation. There are also mined areas along this wall became inhabitable, and also it has a very limited economic production. Those challenges, huge challenges, required practical measures on our side to deal with the situation. And in this context, we developed our NDC, and we identified through it the urgent measures for adaptation with climate change and mitigation of its limits. And we did that through strengthening development, which is based on renewables instead of fossil energy. And we supported NDC by having an NAP or NAP through the common ministerial initiatives that included several ministries. In the Sahrawi refugees camps, we developed agricultural systems to reduce the use of water. We also developed modern means with lower costs for housing. And the purpose of that is to face the increasing risks of floods, in addition to the spread out of using solar energy in small units. We also have experienced some electricity projects using solar energy, wind energy, and we're using it also in medical facilities in remote and isolated areas. There we use solar energy. Mr. President, although we have a desert nature, but we do have so many resources to provide to the blue economy in Africa. We have long coasts, and it's very good for fisheries. And our coast, which goes as far as 1,110 kilometers, the land there is known for its resources, and of course it's adopted by Ramsar Convention. Those areas are Wadi Saqiya, Bujdur, Dakhla Bay, and Sabkha Imlili. And although all those resources are exposed to climate change, because of the excessive depletion of those resources under occupation, but our country emphasizes that it's committed to execute and implement cautious plans in this area. And this is in harmony with the African initiatives and its goals to protect the African coasts in Africa. In addition to our work or setting out administrative plans for the important environmental areas, and according to the climate change requirements, we're going to work with other countries and have partnerships and with those countries and African organizations to build our national capacities and to exchange experience in relation to the blue economy. The delay of the termination of the occupation by the United Nations, which is the last in Africa, that doesn't mean that we are fully participation in the international global efforts to face climate change and its detrimental impacts. it is illogical that we're deprived of getting the required and allocated financing to face climate change. And we're also deprived of the technical assistance through the climate change mechanism under the United Nations and other organizations. We cannot be deprived from our rights and duty to take part with Africa and the world in this kind of efforts against climate change. And also, we have been coexisting for years and years with those dire and difficult climate circumstances like other countries. We should be represented in the new FCCC and also in the COP. And also we should sign also the Paris agreement and take part in the negotiations, and to also adopt our NDC regularly to the UNFCCC. Our voice is and will be an African voice, and it's going to support the African voice.